Now we're going to take a look at the 17th president of the United States, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, of course, becoming president when Lincoln was assassinated as he was Lincoln's vice president. But he was not Lincoln's first vice president. He was not vice president during Lincoln's first term. Lincoln's first vice president was Hannibal Hamlin. And Lincoln, I believe, thought when he was running for re-election against McClellan that in order for him to win, he had to show that he was going to be more conciliatory. McClellan was a former general who had run on a campaign that he could quickly end the war, that he was willing to make compromises with the South most likely to end things, and that was kind of his campaign. Lincoln, perhaps trying to show that he also was willing to be conciliatory, was looking at other candidates. He was looking at a number of war Democrats. He was also looking at, apparently, at one point, a guy named Benjamin Butler, which would have been very interesting considering what he did in New Orleans. But that's a topic for another discussion. If you want to look up Benjamin Butler in New Orleans, I believe he went by Spoons, or derogatorily went by Spoons. I think Reconstruction would have gone very differently had that been the pick. But he did not. He went with a war Democrat, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, I believe, was a senator from Tennessee, who was one of the few senators who did not leave Congress to go join the Confederacy. But Andrew Johnson was not a great person in many ways, which we'll kind of get into. He had an alcohol problem. Reportedly, during the inauguration for vice presidency, he was drunk and gave a long, incoherent speech. At least that's what many reports say. It's hard to tell if that's 100% true because many reports of Johnson after the fact were very negative for reasons that we'll get into. Let's start with growth. So let's do the positives first, then we'll do the rest. Under his watch, they did acquire Alaska. It was called Seward's Folly, but it was definitely not Seward's Folly. It's a huge state, many valuable natural resources, not a lot of downside to its acquisition. So that's a physical growth, large amount of land. Now let's talk about the rest. Andrew Johnson likely killed any hope of Reconstruction being successful. Maybe it could have been salvaged later on by some later decisions we'll get to. But coming in, there was a lot of hope for Reconstruction. There was a lot of understanding that the South had been very, very defeated and would have to accept terms and conditions put upon it. We had a Congress willing to pass amendments, not just laws, but constitutional amendments to give rights to the freedmen and to pass laws to protect the freedmen. There were laws in place around treason. And in fact, the Constitution itself made clear that those who were treasonous against the United States would lose their rights. And so voting in the South very likely could have been and should have been something that was controlled for a long period of time that would theoretically have been earned back by former Confederates. Johnson's first amnesty toward the Confederates is arguably understandable. It was a general amnesty for the common soldier and the common person. It did not include officers for the most part. It did not include the planter class. It was specifically just a general amnesty toward the common man who might have been a soldier in the war. And you can argue against it, but from the concept of truth and reconciliation, it made sense. Johnson's second amnesty is completely, in my opinion, unforgivable. Forgiving the political class, the planter class, basically reestablishing all of the old government that was the government that agreed to the Confederacy being created in the first place. And that amnesty basically created a situation where you would have on the ballot the people who were there before, you would have everyone able to vote for them, and you returned to power the people who had oppressed the black voters, the black people, the slaves, for centuries. It was an unforgivable decision. You combine that with his active undermining of the Reconstruction implementation as laws were passed to the point that when he tried to fire the person handling Reconstruction, he was impeached, although not removed. He did everything in his power to undermine Reconstruction. And when you read about what was happening at the time, and you read about particularly in places like Louisiana, where it was successful, where black political leaders were gaining power and creating infrastructure and creating the opportunity for there to be a multiracial society down there and for them to really take control of their own destiny, only to have Johnson pull the rug out from under them and functionally create all the conditions that would allow the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups to rise and terrorize and do all the horrors that we know came with later stages of Reconstruction. That's all on Johnson, and it's unforgivable, and it's stagnated the growth of the South to this day. It was unforgivable. It was cruel. It was evil, and it falls on his plate. So for growth, we're going to give him a low grade, even though we got Alaska. For finances, it's a tough one. You have to be amazed at how quickly the United States recovered, particularly in terms of hyperinflation. There had been a lot of debt taken out by the North to fund the war. And in the South, the currency of the South was completely tossed aside. There was hyperinflation. It was a horrible economy, but it recovered remarkably quickly. Now, a lot of that, I think, falls to Lincoln and the Congress setting up the infrastructure around the Homestead Act, around all of the various creation of infrastructure that would then come to fruition at the end of the war. And I think that was very impressive. I don't know if that falls on Johnson, but you can't take it away from Johnson. It occurred during his time, and he didn't do much to undermine it. Not that he really had the ability to. He and Congress were constantly fighting with each other, but he did allow things to succeed, and to his credit, some of the things were successful. Economically, the country went from what should have been a complete collapse after the war to a booming post-war economy. Now, you also might say that tends to happen when you have an entire class of people trained in military structure and discipline returning to a place where a lot of people have died, so there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of repairs. That can, that is a stimulus to the economy. But it's still impressive, and I do think you can't knock him too badly for that one. Similarly, in international politics, there was an incident at this time where France had seized much of Mexico. In fact, I think France had seized all of Mexico. And there was a threat that France might expand or do all sorts of other things. And he sent troops to the border of France and Mexico. And that pressure actually weakened the French regime and allowed Mexico to take back control of Mexico. That's positives. Those are all positives on his record. And again, acquiring Alaska is a positive on his record. So I can't give him a major knock for international politics. But the last two, war and security, and did it leave the country better or worse? War and security, he basically allowed for a paramilitary force to terrorize the Southern black population. He allowed for the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. He allowed for the creation of all of the paramilitary groups down there that led to decades and decades of mass murders and violence in the South, and he did very little to stop it. And so when anybody came in afterwards, it was already too well established. And by giving amnesty to the former Confederate leaders, they were just able to reorganize their same battalions, taking back many of the weapons they took home with them, and turning them against the black population. That is not a recipe for improving the security of a country, and it's a black mark on his name. Better or worse? Again, same thing. He inherited an opportunity for the country to move forward and for the South to finally become a part of the world, to not be completely dependent on agricultural slavery. And instead, he created a situation where Jim Crow was going to be coming 20 years down the road. And in the meantime, there was just going to be bloody massacres and insecurity and lack of trust for the government. That all falls on his ledger. So where does that put him? I thought about this for a while, because he's a horrible president. And I think when you read historical accounts, unless you're reading from that, I can't remember what it's group, there's the Confederate revisionists, basically, for all intents and purposes. I know that's not what they're called, who make arguments that Johnson did what was necessary, the incredibly racist history. Aside from them, any serious historian gives Johnson incredibly bad marks and either puts him, he's usually in the debate for worst president of all time. But then you have Buchanan, and my God, was Buchanan a horrible president? So given that, I'm going to put Andrew Johnson at 16, and James Buchanan will remain the worst president at 17.